Hi everyone, welcome back to Mastering Change. Today's conversation is one that goes far beyond the personal experience of trauma. It's about the systems, structures, and global forces that shape how we hurt and how we heal.
Our guest is Dr. Christy Gibson. She's a family physician, trauma therapist, educator, and author of the Modern Trauma Toolkit. But more than that, she's someone who's redefining what healing looks like at the individual, community, and even societal level.
We talk about everything from her work with refugees and addiction recovery to her experiences in Nepal during the earthquakes, to why she believes the DSM is no longer fit for purpose and what we could build in its place.
Christy's message is clear. Trauma doesn't just live in our bodies. It lives in our policies, our histories, our healthcare systems, and it's going to take us all to heal it. She brings a deeply human and hopeful lens to topics that can often feel overwhelming.
Let's dive in. Christy Gibson, it's my pleasure to welcome you to our podcast today. Thank you for joining us, and hello.
Hi there. I was about to say morning, but I realized that doesn't apply to you at all.
Hi, it's afternoon, well into the afternoon here. We start every podcast with a little game that we play with our participants. It's a game of cards, and on each card is a little prompt. The prompt will lead to a sort of story, so an icebreaker, if you will, which will help you connect with us and connect with the audience as well. So I will read the first card that I picked up, which says, I wish people would introduce me by talking about blank rather than blank.
Interesting. So I'm a physician. I'm a family doctor in Canada. And one of the things that I've been trying to figure out for the last 10 years or so of my career is how not to get kind of put in the box of what people assume about physicians. So just this year, I finished a doctorate in transdisciplinary study through Middlesex in the UK. And transdisciplinary basically means you don't fit in a box. And I think what I've been trying to figure out, both for myself personally and professionally, is how to explain who I am in a way that I can come up with adjectives. I'm a really curious learner. So when I studied trauma, I didn't study one modality. I studied so many different modalities so that I was able to clinically provide a toolkit, but also to share that knowledge. So I'm not a physician who works in an office. I'm a person who's on TikTok. I'm a person who authors and writes, daily. I'm writing fiction actually again. And I'm a person who is really into design thinking and social innovation, and how do we make big changes in the world when the one-to-one relationship that I have with patients grounds me, but I'm really interested in how can I use, my credentials and my way of being and knowing in the world to affect systems change. And that's something that I think not a lot of trauma therapists address, because even though we recognize that there are systemic problems causing trauma, we kind of think of ourselves as powerless. And I'm really interested not just in my own power, but like my community and my network, and how can we make systems change that are causing the trauma. So, yeah, I feel like it's really easy to summarize somebody like me with the word doctor, but that's not how I see myself anymore.
That's really empowering as well. From our understanding of that world, that ability to reframe that definition, to be able to look at the person in front of you, not only as a patient or a client, but as holistically. It's what Gabor, that's not why the addiction, but why the pain is. It's going deeper into kind of the driver. So I that really motivates me to hear that could be the future of clinical practice as well, is to kind of think like that.
I think that's it, isn't it, as well? It's the idea that so many of, in the UK, we call people doctors or GPs, or it's that they are very often narrow with their understanding of, or when they specialize, they literally specialize in one thing, and they aren't able to kind of look at this 360 kind of viewpoint of a patient or a client. And I think it's, I think we're seeing a shift in society now slowly with doctors, mainly because their patients are they're seeing the same people come in time and time again, and they're not able to help them, and they're not understanding why. So they are starting, the good ones are starting to look further and dig deeper. But I don't think the medical system, certainly in the UK, is set up to encourage that. I think it's a
I think, but I agree, Minty. I think that we are seeing peripheral change and a movement towards preventative health, if only tokenistic at the moment, social prescribing and things like that. But I do see that people recognize that this traditional model of kind of diagnose symptomatic presentation and treat in a very kind of one-dimensional way is shifting. I guess the question is, how do we inspire fatigued clinical, that how do we create the cultural and systemic shift in that space? Because you're obviously, I mean, I could just, from you very enlightened and very open and very creative, as well as having that strong clinical, but I think that those qualities are somewhat engineered out with a traditional path to that as well. So I think finding ways to bring that in will certainly help that cause. But yeah,
I was just at the RCGP conference in Liverpool 2 months ago. Oh, maybe 3 now. Anyway, it was not that long ago, and my goal was to try to spread the word. And it was really funny because my publisher had a little booth, and I had brought some extra copies of the Modern Trauma Toolkit because I had just come from a different conference, and so I had some extra to sell. And I just stood in front of the booth and accosted every GP that walked by and said, "What do you think about trauma in your clinical practice?" And it was really interesting. Some answers I got were so insightful, and others just really hadn't considered it. So I started to speak about the kinds of trauma that they might have overlooked, from ancestral and pre-verbal trauma to the ways that people are showing up in their office. Like, do you have patients who are non-compliant? Is it possible that they're a bit dissociated because they just feel so overwhelmed? Do you have patients that just seem to be running from one place to the next, or they show up really irritable? Is that possibly a manifestation of fight and flight? And do you know how to manage that? And once I started to ask questions and they got curious, most of them bought the book. We managed to sell a lot of the Modern Trauma Toolkit in that single session. And I got 2 emails within a month. So somebody had really dug into the book. I suspect they read it on the train home. And they said, I didn't recognize how much trauma was in my clinical practice and the different ways that it showed up. And you've changed the way that I view my patients. And that was my goal. And even if I reach just a few people, I'm hoping that the word of mouth will continue. So one of the places that I show up to make those system changes is medical conferences. And, I'll be in Malaysia speaking to family docs and psychiatrists next month about this. So I really think that those leverage points are open and people are interested and they're curious, especially because they don't have the tools. And so, you're in medicine to help people, but if you're not given both the point of view and the tools to manage it, it can be really hard and frustrating for you too. And even that's traumatic on physicians. So it kind of goes everywhere.
We find it absolutely fascinating. Well, terrifying that nowhere on the curriculum as you train to be a general practitioner in the UK is any reference to trauma. Like there is very little in the process of becoming a medical doctor of understanding that. And yet we know from statistics that a lot of presentation in general practice is rooted in trauma, as you've described. It's not.
I don't know much about the medical degree, to be honest. It's a 7-year degree. I don't know if they do it. I know that in psychotherapy or psychiatry, or a psychology degree in the UK, there is zero reference to trauma, which is what I would find, that's surely, to become a psychologist, you imagine that trauma is what shows up in your office daily, like, but they just don't have it. So I don't know about medical doctors though, Emma, whether they have a trauma. I imagine they have certain trauma.
What Christy's just described is that you get in medical doctor. I'm getting, were they general practitioners that were coming up to you that were saying, yeah, general practitioners who are going, when most people in the medical world, when you say trauma, they think accident and emergency or ER. They go, trauma is the big stuff that happens physically to the body, not the stuff that's, expressing in the presentations in general practice, in first response, so
One of
Well,
my
and we're stuck in the curriculum because the big book, like the DSM, which is what everyone references, even though it was only intended to use for billing and data management and statistics, like that's literally in the title. People use it as the diagnostic criteria, and the only thing that shows up in there is PTSD. And so there's so many of us that are saying, what about complex trauma? And if we were to start recognizing and having a global definition of complex trauma, how many of those personality disorders would still exist? And I honestly think there's just a really slow turnaround to recognize that the DSM is inadequate to manage complexity, and complexity not just in the individual, but in the family and the community and these greater ecosystems, because politics and climate and contagion, this is all causing a lot of collective trauma that no clinicians are being taught how to address. And that was what really interested me, was not just the individual system, which obviously is really impactful for a person, but what about these greater systems, and not just what is the problem, but what are the solutions? And so when I think of trauma, I think of it as really affecting all of these different fractals of a system and manifesting as fractals, because these really traumatized people are causing trauma at the political and leader and industry level too.
yeah, we talk about that whole global fear and anxiety and then doubt that's just perpetuating because it's traumatize people. So this leads me really nicely on then to
Can I just jump in with a question about the DSM? Because whilst we were just talking about that, is a question that I've always wanted to talk about when it comes to the DSM, because it comes up all the time when Bessel sort of talks. He talks about the DSM and he talks about how he attempted to kind of recategorize it and have complex trauma put into it all those years ago, and it just never happened. Now, I know the DSM as being, as you said, it's used for billing. It's also, now, as you say now, people use it as a diagnostic criteria, and it's mainly because insurance companies need people to have a diagnosis in order to pay, right? So you said you're interested in systems change and in finding solution. And this is always a question I've always wanted to sort of say to people. How then, without eradicating insurance, obviously in the UK we need it less, but still some people need it. How can we, what could we do? What could we do? What is the change? It might be too big a question, but how can we change that need? Because the DSM is useless, right? It doesn't work for anything really, other than getting insurance to pay. So what would we do?
I think there's a lot of options. I do believe that complex trauma and its manifestations need to be looked at more closely, because the DSM-6, when that eventually shows up, would be very, very different if that was the case. One thing that they're moving towards, and when I was, writing the Modern Trauma Toolkit, I did some research into this, is having the community be more involved. So initially, a lot of these iterations were written by professionals, not just psychiatrists and a few psychologists that were experts in their field and doing lots of research, but a lot of them were tied to industry. So there was even some subconscious incentive to kind of link diagnoses that were attached to the medication that they had been studying for a really long time. So a lot of pharmaceutical bias was introduced into the DSM. So we need to be able to detach that. It's kind of like politics, like the lobbyists for big ag and big health and all of these other bigs should not be able to lobby the government, just the same way that people who are tied to industry should not be able to lobby, the book that's kind of helping us practice. And they were starting to get a little bit more community involvement. And I think it did make a difference in the last iteration was, people with autism or people with ADHD were invited to the table to talk about their own experiences. And the more that we welcome community as expert, the more that we will all be able to understand what the experience of mental health is like. And I mean, frankly, we're all experiencing it. For people to say, like, I am the separate person who's a professional and understands it from that perspective versus I'm a person who also has a lived experience. And that's one thing that I share too. I mean, my exploration of trauma and PTSD came after I was working in Nepal and happened to be there during the 2015 earthquakes, not as a provider, but as a person, as a human who felt very vulnerable and fragile and really wanted to be rescued, and was also witnessing community as expert coming together to like get the foundational needs met of food and shelter of their neighbors, but also, learning how to work through that. So I gained some curiosity because of my personal experiences and was kind of my eyes were open to how much trauma was in my clinical practice because I've always worked in equity denied communities and it was right in front of me and I didn't see it. And now I can't unopen my eyes to it.
I just think that's 100% the way we should kind of move forward. I just wonder who currently owns the DSM? Who currently sort of publishes it? And I don't even think I know that answer to that.
It's the equivalent of the GMC in the US.
Yeah, I think it's the American Psychiatric Association. So,
And they
powerful movements.
and would they be funded by Big Pharma then, or would they be funded by? I wonder if what it would take.
Not directly, but this is the thing. What you touched on there is that everything's got intertwined, and the challenges of the last 100 years of capitalism as in its form. I mean, I've worked prior to coming to this space, and having my own kind of revelation. I've worked with big pharma and global consumer goods businesses, and I kind of, they're not, but these are machines that compel behaviors and beliefs and, rituals.
You worked in the industry, which was consumer goods industry, and there's no way that any consumer, a brilliant brand, would go out and launch a new product, for example, without doing that community research, right? They do it because they want to know the need state of the people they're going to sell to. The same way, even though it's not selling to, the same way the DSM should do that market research essentially. If you're going to start diagnosing people, how can you do that without that market research? It should be worked in the same way.
There's so many consequences to the DSM in capitalist construct, which they are responsible for. So, I mean, there's just a lot of forces at play that are competing for share and competing for dominance, I think. And so it is highly complicated, the cause and effect of a change that you're describing in the context of pharma and insurance companies and healthcare. I mean, in the healthcare model that exists in the US is kind of, it's a highly commercial piece. It's for, so I think, I mean, it's a big one, isn't it? It's a big, gnarly beast. So nothing but respect for anyone who's willing to go there. And I think your language of community, because as you put it, and as Araminta just kind of reiterated, it's really hard to reject that. How do you not bring that lived experience into the conversation about what it is to exist and what it is needed to heal?
Even when I was writing my book, the Modern Trauma Toolkit, I had hired some beta readers with lived experience to make sure that the book sounded safe and nurturing and really inclusive because, acknowledging that I'm a white woman of, middle age in the world, we can do quite a bit of harm inadvertently, and sometimes deliberately, when we're not conscious of all of these other ways that people show up. So I hired women of color, one was trans, and I wanted to just make sure that this book felt safe. The reason that I wrote it was because so many people said to me, um, I want to read a book about trauma. And the offerings out there were leaning towards the academic or leaning towards the male gaze and leaning towards a perspective that I didn't necessarily know wouldn't compound trauma. So my goal was to write it in really not just accessible language in terms of easy to read, which certainly was a part of the goal, but easy emotionally to read, that it would be gentle and nurturing, and that they would come away from the end of it with like, oh, I think I have some solutions that I feel comfortable to explore. And one of the words on the front was the word personalized, because I think that so many people, even if they're not tied to pharma, they get tied to, oh, this one therapy is the solution. It's going to fix everything for everybody. And they, of course, they have a bias. It's working really well for them in their practice. But I do find that the opposite of trauma isn't like going down a single pathway, because that's actually what a trauma reflex does in the brain. It's a great deal of flexibility. And so in the Modern Trauma Toolkit, I have like 40 different activities that people can practice, and they will start to learn a little bit more about their nervous system, a little bit more about the ways that they can shift, a little bit about the systems that are causing trauma within their physical mind body. And it's that personalization that I think is really important. So I what I try to do when I'm speaking on social media, I've been a TikToker. We'll see we'll see what happens with the America again, with the United States as they address TikTok, because I've found so much community there, and I've learned so much, as well as shared a great deal as TikTok Trauma Doc. So I'm trying to figure out how can, if that platform disappears, how else can I leverage the learning and the sharing, and the growth within community, and the ability for me to continue to share more and more tools.
I think there will be, I mean, just as an aside to that, I think there will always be new channels pop up because the community drives it. Do you know, and that's the beauty of community, is that it's a bit like when everyone departed from, Twitter, because Twitter was no longer Twitter, and people moved to new platforms. And so I think there will always be a way of finding that community, but it is disappointing when you built it and nurtured it within a particular space.
My question was, Christy, is who was your book for? Because I mean, you say like it's obviously brilliant for the medical doctors when you go to these conferences, because it helps them with things that they might be seeing in their practice that they weren't aware of, or weren't aware that they were related to trauma. But when you wrote the book, what in your mind, who was it geared towards?
So clinically, my practice, and since I've closed my family practice about 4 years ago, I work in refugee health, both as a family doctor and as a trauma therapist, and I work in adult addictions. And so the health literacy of my patients tends to be on the lower side. I mean, not always. Everyone's different. If we see refugees who have doctorates themselves, right? Um, but my goal was to try to write everything at a grade 8 level, so it was really, really easy to understand. So can the doctors get something out of it? Absolutely. But part of it was to say, this is a reference for you to learn some tools so that when you see emotional dysregulation, you're going to get a lot more curious and humble and start to ask questions in a different way. And then ultimately the book was written for my patients, so that I literally give it to them. So every single patient that I see, I give them a copy of the book, and I say, this is our reference material that we're going to be working on a somatic tool like tapping. And tapping is in chapter 19, and then there's a QR code with a video, so you can follow along and you don't have to remember it. These are invitations, never expectations, but if you want to, chapter 19 is something that will help you deepen your understanding of how tapping works. So I really wanted to have this reference for my patients, but my goal is to just get people to read a book about trauma that is a primer. It's going to give you a foundational understanding, not just of what's happening in your body, and like even the PTSD criteria. Like if I use clinical words like hypervigilance to one of my patients, they're going to look at me blankly and be like, what are you talking about, lady? So in the Modern Trauma Toolkit, I'll explain hypervigilance is your brain waiting for something else bad to happen because bad things have happened. And your brain is starting to think, wow, the world is kind of dangerous and bad things happen to me. So hypervigilance is your brain's way of waiting for that next bad thing. And it makes sense because it's trying to protect you, it's not trying to hurt you. And the way that I explain it like that, then patients develop more self compassion. They don't necessarily think, well, I'm broken, there's something wrong with me. And they'll think, oh, yeah, that's so interesting that my brain is working this hard to try to protect me. And the more that we can gain some inner sense of safety, the more they can let that go. So I really wanted to use a language that would help them understand the mechanisms of that brain protection, and that they could come out on the other side of it with more clarity and self-compassion. One of the things I've said on TikTok is because I always wear glasses because I'm of a certain age, and I'll say my lenses right now are clarity and self-compassion, and that's my goal is to help the people who read the book to develop that lens as they look at trauma. There is academic understanding. I mean, when I'm talking about psychedelics, I wanted to talk about the research because I don't want to be seen as this person who's so avant-garde that I'm not really paying attention to what the evidence says, which is quite strong, by the way. So there is an academic understanding of some of what's happening there. Like when I described epigenetics and how trauma is in our bones and we inherit it through our lineage. And even if we are showing up with trauma responses and we don't necessarily know the traumatic events that happened to us, maybe it happened several generations back. And I'll get into the science about how that happens. But I really want people to understand at this visceral level, like, oh my gosh, I can relate to this. It resonates. I've got more clarity about how my mind body system is showing up in the world.
And what's really interesting is when you can empower an individual with that knowledge and that understanding, that self-compassion, then is infectious. It goes, it extends out then, isn't it? Because it's not just you that you're looking through the lens of all of that knowledge and awareness. It's everybody else, how you meet. I remember working with, Gabor, but Satram and Compassionate Inquiry. And just that ability to kind of, you know, understand, be compassionate. I think we've lost connection with, again, in the last 100 years, what compassion is and how it shows up and how the power of that in the context of healing lots of the challenges that we've got. So would you say that so if you've closed your practice now, you're predominantly working, so you're working with individuals and the refugee, or is that community work that you're working with communities of refugees and what did you say, refugees and adults suffering with addiction?
Yeah, I mean, I try to do both. So when I think about the work that I do now, especially since finishing that doctorate, I'm super deliberate with trying to work both with the individual and with the ecosystem that's kind of creating the problem. So I spoke at the Refugee Health Conference a couple of years back and explained to all of the refugee practitioners, not just physicians, but everybody working with refugees, what trauma is and how it's showing up so that more and more people are recognizing it and intervening earlier, and also showing up differently themselves, because so much of it is about your tone of voice and your facial expression. And um, chapter 3 in the Modern Trauma Toolkit explains polyvagal theory, but I wanted the refugee practitioners to understand how they could show up with refugees in a way that might co-regulate their nervous system and allow them to be in a calmer body, because all of us can do that. I was at the International Addictions Conference in Istanbul this September, and then I was at the Canadian Addictions Conference in November. So my goal is to try to spread the word at so many different levels. So while I think teachers need to understand this, parents need to understand this, one of the most triggering professions to my patients are dentists. And so dentists are constantly causing trauma by not asking and not describing what they're doing and putting their hands in really private places. And of course, they're not trying to do that, but it is really triggering for lots of folks. I was just speaking to a realtor on a podcast recently, and I just was thinking, how much realtors are dealing with constant change, whether it's a divorce or a death, or even good stresses like marriage and growing families. that can cause traumatic responses because these really, really big stresses can show up like a reflex. And all of a sudden, somebody's doom scrolling and they're not paying attention and they're interacting with their realtor through those reflexes of fight, flight, and freeze. And the realtor's like, what's happening? So basically, anyone who's facing the public needs to have a greater understanding of trauma. So my goal is to get this into schools. So I run the nonprofit that I was working with in Nepal. That's Global Family Med Foundation, trying to get better primary care overseas. I also run the Belong Foundation, which is trying to work at a systems level on complex problems like climate change and climate psychology, and complexity of the systems that are causing these traumatic events. I run a company called Safer Spaces Training, where we are working with organizations to be more trauma informed and to develop safer communication strategies. So anybody who's working with the public, I want to work with them so that they have a greater understanding of trauma and psychological safety and psychological first aid, because more and more people are showing up in a dysregulated way, and then that can be contagious too. So just as, there's vicarious trauma and vicarious responses, we can show up in a way that helps people co-regulate. And I just think more and more people need that information. So yeah, I mean, I'm trying to think, how can I leverage social media? How can I write more books that will help explain all of these complex problems? And then how can I show up and leverage all of the many letters behind my name so that I can, introduce these topics to folks. My next goal is I just got certified in lifestyle medicine, and one of the pillars of lifestyle medicine, I mean, it's a beautiful way of practicing because it's talking about sleep and diet and exercise and all of these foundational things that people want to learn about, but they've got this toxic stress pillar and it's stress management, and they talk so much about cognitive therapies, and those benefit a lot of people, but they don't have anything about somatic or body-based strategies. And I really think that we need more holistic understanding of the ways that we can intervene with toxic stress. So that's something that I want to share with that community.
Really, you should definitely look at integrative medicine for mental health, which is the event in San Diego in September, because that's looking at that intersection between those two worlds and the importance of the bridge that needs to be built. Because if you talk to our audience in Oxford, they know very little about an integrative approach and the tools that are available. Like, it's a whole new toolkit to the one that you're describing with all of the modality, so it's just this other set of tools that are available. And similarly, like you've just described, look at the integrative and they don't know anything that we've been talking about around, and yet they're obsessed with root cause, and root cause is so often rooted in trauma. So I think that's a really interesting.
I straddle those two worlds for that exact reason. You totally nailed it, Emma.
Yeah, no, thank you. Yeah, I think that's why it sang to me as soon as you said it, because there's, I think also I can see that you're a synthesizer. And I think, you've got lots of people in this field who've got their own modality or approach and their own idea and their research that substantiates that. But it's often impenetrable to many. It's inaccessible to most. And what we need is the ability to take those complex scientific concepts and democratize it and make it accessible and available, because then the things that resonate, people can go deeper, but you're giving them an access in an accessible, giving them access truly, by I love the grade 8 analogy, because again, if you pick up The Body Keeps the Score and try and read that as somebody who is it's a wonderful book. It's an amazing body of work, but it's not for everyone. It's not accessible to everyone. So yeah.
Oh, I had so many patients try to get through chapter 1 and were so triggered because the perspective was the person who committed a sexual assault and not the person who had it done to them. And they couldn't get past chapter 1. So honestly, it was one of the instigations for my writing the Modern Trauma Toolkit. I love how you said the word democratize. One of the things that I was exploring deeply in my doctoral work was decolonization. I think a lot of these structures that are tied to capitalism are also tied to colonialism. I mean, you're from the UK, I'm in Canada, and we have such a huge issue with how we ongoingly treat First Nations folks here. So decolonization is really, really important to me. And for me to write a book that was really accessible and solution focused was part of the way that I want to decolonize in the world. My involvement of the beta readers and my ongoing commitment to give, like, I've probably given 600 copies of this book away, including to many Indigenous First Nations around this area. So decolonization was a really, really important part of that systemic view of trauma, because I think if we're not really consciously participating in decolonization, especially those of us with privilege and seen as the experts, we will create that status quo ongoingly, and we will participate in a way that is um, complicit. Even though we don't necessarily want to be, we do it unless we're deliberately not doing it.
Yeah, and I also think that's part of that bridge building, is because in the process of colonizing, we've disregarded so many ancient techniques that had gone on for thousands of years as very effective ways of recognizing and healing and building community, and so I celebrate that too. I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Linda Tai, because she's very much focused on
Yeah, of course.
yeah
Yeah. So in my book, I've studied Ayurvedic counseling. I'm a Qigong teacher. Um, and so in my book, I definitely integrate ancient ways of knowing and just also cross-cultural ways of knowing. Like the way that my refugees show up, it's different. And so for me to kind of learn so much from that, one of the things that I learned from the Yazidi community that had gone through so much tragedy and toxic, like just violence, one of the ways that they healed was via community, watching wedding videos, because there was music, there was chanting, there was people dancing in circles, there was their cultural dress that they could reconnect to. And one of the most healing things that I ever did in that community was remind all of them, well, are you watching wedding videos? And it just relaxed all of their nervous systems in a way that all of these modalities that I'm trained in, from havening and tapping to, parts work and NARM, the neuroaffective relational model. I mean, these are beautiful modalities that I've studied and I love to share with folks. But wedding videos worked really well for the Yazidis. And so I'm really interested in cultural ways of learning, because I- if we if we can look at community as the expert, so much of that healing has always happened in community. Like, people have always sung together. We've always moved together, whether that's dancing in a circle, and
eating
Cooking. Cooking. I mean, I'm like a nodding dog here, because I really, everything you're saying is like resonates so much. It's getting back to those, the things we used to do in community way more than we do now. That's from cooking to eating to dancing to singing in choirs to sports, all of this stuff that we don't do anywhere near as much. And if you have a crisis of a large scale crisis, there's no way you can get enough medical professionals out there to help everyone who needs it. But you can create, I don't know, community peer led stuff that happens that will have a massive
regulate nervous systems, because that's what these things do. They calm and they soothe and they create the capacity for healing.
and if we circle all the way back to where my journey began in 2015, that's what I saw happen in Nepal. The earthquakes hit, thousands of houses collapsed. So many people were injured and even passed away. And yet, what I really saw, and my takeaway was community heals. And so that's so much of what I want to explore too, is what does community already know and practice? And so my book wasn't like, this is the modality that helps. It's, what are the different ways that you can explore? Can you even explore your own ancestors? So I talk about not just ancestral trauma, but ancestral resilience. Not just vicarious trauma, but vicarious resilience. And we are none of us exclusively a victim. We are also so much fuller of strengths. And like the ways that the system harms neurodiverse people. What if they can start to recognize the power in that diversity as well? So there always has to be the two sides to the coin, and it exploring that in a way that feels really resonant to you and giving those flexible options was so much about what I wanted to explore in the Modern Trauma Toolkit. And I'm hearing that this resonates. So all of what you're describing in terms of um, dancing in a circle and chanting and listening to different kinds of nature sounds and getting in touch, like we don't just connect with other humans, we connect with nature, with pets, with music. And what are these other ways that we can connect and resonate and restore that balance?
Yeah, yeah. It's fascinating. We could definitely continue with this conversation. There's so many places to go, but I'm very conscious of time. So I'm going to ask the question, which I think I know the answer to actually after our conversation, but it's the question that we ask all our guests, and it's if there was one button you could push, one lever for change that would create this shift from the world of fear and anxiety, and what would that be?
I can visualize it right now, but it's interconnectedness. I'm sure you knew that. And
Really?
ancient Buddhist wisdom, right? I mean, there's been millennia of knowledge that interconnectedness is the answer to everything. But if we had a greater understanding of our interconnectedness of the ecosystem, of course, this climate emergency wouldn't be happening. If people had a greater sense of interconnectedness of all beings, we wouldn't be harming other non-human beings as much, and there wouldn't be such rampant inequity. There would be no billionaires. Um, I really do believe that a sense of interconnectedness is the solution. And so much of, and why I called the book The Modern Trauma Toolkit is because in modern times, we kind of end up more and more bubbled and isolated. And I think the pandemic has really harmed people in that way, is it's taken from our connectedness. So the more that we can connect in all of these different ways to each other and to our own inner worlds, our ancient lineages, that interconnectivity is what heals.
I like to hope that the lack of connection that happened during COVID can actually be a springboard, because I think that what it also did is it heightened awareness. And I still think that awareness is around about the importance of connection and community and physically being together. Um, so I don't think we've done it, but I think because it's still very present, it's still, and the generation of my children growing up are very, a large proportion of their life was spent during that lockdown period. So I'm very hopeful that that value might manifest in that generation coming through as they realize the importance of it, and people like you continue to do this work. But yeah,
It's
thank
why
you.
I do on TikTok is because the kids get it. They're both really comfortable with expressing their emotions in a way that the older generations can't do yet. And they also understand what's needed. So I feel very hopeful too. And it's not that I want to lay it all on them and say, oh, you got to fix what we caused, but how can we work together in an interconnected way throughout those generations that all have their different strengths?